Number 1. Walking home. Listening to a lot of scary stories let me know how just plain awful some people can be. And it's hard for me to understand why so many of these people are the way that they are. So, I thought I would share an experience with you that happened to me. I cannot to this day even begin to understand why the person involved did what he did. I lived way out in the country when I was growing up. My family was also pretty poor. When I wanted to hang out with friends from school, I often had to take very long walks to and from their homes. Using gas for non-essential trips was not something my family did very often. So walking down country gravel roads was something I did quite often. When I was 13, I had a really scary experience. My friend Jack had gotten a Nintendo Entertainment System for his birthday, and this was around 1990. My family had an old Atari 2600, so that was really all I got to play for video games. And so I spent a lot of time over his house that summer playing video games, and really it was a completely new world for me. On this one day, I spent the entire day and the entire evening over at his house. We were playing Castlevania, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, a Super Mario Brothers, and all sorts of other games all day. And before I knew it, it was midnight. Normally, I would have just slept over at Jack's house. It was something I had been doing often anyway. But I had to be home in the morning because we were leaving early to go to church, which was something that my family deemed essential. And they would not be coming to Jack's to pick me up. I had to leave and walk home. This was a several-mile walk. It could take me about 2 hours to make the entire thing. And the walk was mostly on gravel roads, surrounded by thick woods, and lighted by nothing but the moon. So I walked down the paved road that Jack lived off of. There was a small convenience store where I turned onto the gravel road that led home. I mentioned this because I was surprised to see someone on the porch of the store. That store had been closed for hours, and I'd never seen anyone hanging around outside it before. I think I stared at the man just a little bit too long, which some people consider to be the worst thing. He stared back, but I really could not make out what his facial expressions were. It was way too dark. However, he did get up at one point, and I took that as a sign to not stare at him anymore. I walked past the store and turned onto the gravel road. At this point, I was trying to not look at the guy, but I have to admit I was watching him out of the corner of my eye. The man walked over to the side of the store, and he was watching me as I was walking. He actually went all the way onto the gravel, and that was the last I looked at him. I just kept walking until eventually I was out of sight of the store. Now, being away from the man at the store was only a little bit of a small comfort. I was now walking down the gravel country road in the complete darkness. The trees were dense, and I had a long way to walk without any kind of light. I did eventually get used to the dark, and was able to at least see where I was going and to see the trees. But it wasn't the greatest sight, and I also saw things in the shadows that I knew could not be there. The scariest thing that I ever read was a scene in the book Pinocchio. It was when the puppet was walking through a dark woods, and two murderers lurked in the dark. They attacked him, but he bit one of them and got away. But the scene scared me, and I often thought about it when I was walking through the woods by myself. And there was no doubt that I was thinking about it on that very night. Thinking about the murderers hanging out in the darkness in the woods, invisible because they are protected by the darkness and the trees. My stupid brain shouldn't have focused on that, I know. But that is what your brain does when you are in a situation like that. I just tried my best to put it out of my mind, as I was trying to think of something funny, or at least not scary. I heard a crunching sound behind me that sounded definitely like someone walking on the gravel. I stopped walking and heard them walking still. They weren't very close to me, but it was quiet that night, with nothing but the normal night sounds around us. "Hey, is someone there?" I asked, squinting and trying to see something in the dark. I got no answer. And then I thought about the scary guy at the convenience store. I was already scared from my own thoughts, but this just made it even worse. I tried not to think of that, but I just listened to the crunching on the gravel. After a small amount of time, though, the crunching stopped. That wasn't comforting, though. That was just creepy, and it made no sense. I kept waiting for a little while to see if the sound would come back, but it didn't. So I turned and began walking home again. I'm not sure how much time had passed, but it was quiet for a while. But among the crickets and sounds of other bugs and animals, I began hearing another sound. It was still behind me, but this time it was coming from off the right side of the road. It sounded like someone was walking around in the forest. I just hoped that maybe it was a deer or something like that, but it didn't sound like it. When you lived as far out in the country as I did, you knew the difference between someone walking in the woods and a deer walking in the woods. I knew it was someone who was still a bit behind me, though. My first thought was to pretend I didn't hear it. I don't know why, but it seemed in my mind that acknowledging the last time gave away that I knew someone was following me. And whomever it was must have moved into the woods because of that. So I just kept walking. As I walked, I was hyper aware of the sound of the person who was walking around in the woods, and I got more and more nervous as the sounds kept getting closer and closer to me. I stopped for just a moment and knelt down. I grabbed a handful of gravel off the road and put it in my pocket. I grabbed a second handful and held it in my hand. While I was standing back up, though, I realized that there were no sounds other than the noises of the night, and I realized he must have heard me stop, and stopped too. I wasn't sure what my next move should have been. Should I start walking again? Should I just stand there? What? I was about to take a step when I heard a voice coming to me from the woods.
"I know you saw me at the store,"
it said, in an obvious attempt to not only disguise his voice, but to sound scary. "Leave me alone," I replied, scared. I didn't realize my mistake.
"Now, I know exactly where you are,"
he chuckled. Then I heard noise coming from the woods. He was coming at me. I took the handful of gravel and threw it in the direction of the noise. I threw another handful and another. When I finally heard a yelp of pain, I threw 2 more handfuls at it, and then I turned and ran. But I didn't run on the gravel. I ran into the left side of the woods, and I quickly found myself a really good hiding spot. There was a pine tree, and I was able to easily climb into it. I was still scared, and I realized I had to remain as still as possible. Neither of us had a flashlight, and it was still very dark. I hoped the gravel had hurt him enough that he didn't hear the direction that I had gone in. I did hear some rustling in the trees a little while later, but it eventually went away. And once it was away for good. I don't know how much time had passed, but I figured enough had passed that the guy was gone for good. So I quietly climbed down from the pine tree. Instead of walking on the road, I walked on the side of the road. It made my footfalls considerably less noisy. I was hyper-aware of all the noises around me, waiting for a sound of a man walking around in the woods or on the road. Those noises never came, thank God, and I kept walking until I eventually made it back to my home. We had a long driveway, and I really wanted to just run quickly down the driveway to the house, but I went quietly. Everyone in the house was asleep. I quietly got into the house and got into bed, and it took a long time for me to go to sleep. When I got up, I told my dad about what had happened. He gave me one of his hunting knives and told me to carry it on me, and if it happened again, gut the guy. That was sort of the kind of guy he was. I mean, if the guy had come up to his house, he probably would have gotten a shotgun down his throat. I never had an experience with the guy again. The convenience store had been robbed, and I told the owner about what I saw, but it didn't help. I never got a good look at the guy, so I guess I can't tell you that I never saw him again. If I did, I would have no way of knowing. Number 2. The Scare. I have a very unconventional extended family. My Aunt Carol has gone through a lot of boyfriends and husbands in her life, but the only really long-term one that I remembered was a guy named Norm. He was an okay guy, but was really the sort of guy who was always getting into trouble. His money always came from drugs or from illegal schemes with his friends, and the money was never much money. Like most people in my family, his family didn't have much money. I think every time I visited his family, they always had a new place to live. One of the times I visited, the scariest and strangest thing to ever happen to me in my life occurred. I guess he was building a house. There were several people building houses in the area, which was just on the edge of a large forest. But his family was living in the unfinished house. This is important to know, because the living room of the house was facing the forest, and the couch was placed under a window facing the forest. Well, it wasn't really a window, since no one had put the glass into the window yet. So at night, it was a pretty scary place to sit. I stayed there for about 3 nights. On the first night, Norm, and I had to respect him for trying, attempted to scare me. I was sitting on the couch under the window, and we were watching horror movies. He excused himself, saying he was going next door to get some beer. In reality, he snuck around the window, facing the forest, and he was going to jump through the window and scare me. Well, it didn't work for several reasons. The first is, the leaving the room in an attempt to scare someone was my ploy. So when someone did that, I always figured that them leaving the room during a scary movie was just a ploy. Plus, I was sitting under a huge hole in the wall facing a forest, so to me it was obvious what was going to happen. So when he grabbed me through the window, I simply responded with, "Hey, Norm." He was disappointed but not surprised. I mean, he knew I was so into horror and scary stuff that it may have been obvious. I did tell Norm that my mom was coming over tomorrow to spend one last night here before moving on. She had only begun watching scary movies after her and my dad got divorced, and she would get scared. He should try to scare her. So the next night, this all happened. This was 1991, for reference. So movies took longer to come out on video. I think we watched Child's Play and Flatliners that night. We had everything set up so that my mom would be sitting under the window. We knew she would be scared, because horror movies were never her thing. She had only been watching them for a short time. When he was ready, Norm excused himself. He said he was going to the house over yonder to borrow some cigarettes. Well, he got up and left the house. I saw him circle the house and walked into the woods. His plan was to make some noises in the woods to get my mom's attention. Then he was going to wait until she was involved in the movie again, and then he would sneak up and grab her. Well, the first part of the joke went perfectly. We all heard noises out in the woods beyond the window, but everyone but my mom ignored it. We told her it was probably just the wind, and she was working herself up because of the movie. So we told her to go back to watching it. When we got immersed into the movie again, we all waited and prepared for the big scare. And we waited some more. We kept waiting for Norm to come and do the scare. We all started thinking that Norm was trying to put us all on edge. If he could scare all of us, he would have the last laugh. We waited until the first movie was over. We put in the second. We kept waiting for Norm to make his move, but he never did. My Aunt Carol excused herself and told us she was going over to the other house to see what Norm was up to. I knew she was going into the woods to see what was taking Norm so long. I even saw her go into the woods, and she eventually emerged without Norm and then came back into the house. Carol was frantic and told us Norm was gone. She explained the joke to my mom, and that alarmed us all. Us older family members went out and looked for him. We never found him, and I've never seen Norm again. Like I mentioned, he was into a lot of illegal things, so it wasn't really a surprise that something may have happened to him. It could have been drug dealers or something like that. Those noises we heard in the woods might not have been him trying to scare my mom. It may have been a real struggle. A struggle that resulted in my sort of uncle disappearing forever. Number 3. Camping. I had a really terrifying experience camping one time. I was in a public park, but there were not a whole lot of people there, so I was able to find myself a nice and really sort of private area to set up my tent. I have to admit that while I love the woods, I have always been slightly scared about going deep into them. Fear of getting lost and that sort of thing. So being in a public park was very comforting. One afternoon, I drove down to the local grocery store in order to get some supplies that I needed. And on the way back, I went by a local bar, and I thought it might be nice to stop in for a drink. I had really been by myself for nearly a week at that point, and although I didn't know anyone in the bar, it might be nice to just be around people for a little while. I spent a little time at the bar, just looking around at people and having a light drink. I was watching some guys play pool. I didn't really even notice, though, that I may have been watching too closely. And I guess one of the players got a little irritated at me for watching. The guy wasn't very big. I mean, he might have been even smaller than me. But when he walked over to the bar, he tried to intimidate me. "You got a staring problem, man?" he asked me as he ordered a drink from the bartender. Looking at my Amaretto Stone Sour, he remarked, "I guess you're a fag drinking shit like that and staring at me." I assured the guy I was just watching a game of pool. I even told him if it bugged him, I wouldn't watch. However, he just kept pushing me. I began getting irritated with him and finally lost my cool. He pushed my shoulder, then I pushed him off of me and he fell over the bar stool. In anger, he got back up and pushed me hard. He tried grabbing me, but the bouncer in the bar had already come over. He grabbed the guy and pulled him out of the bar. Although the bouncer didn't put his hands on me, he told me that I had to go also. We were both out in the parking lot as I got into my car to leave. The jerk got into his car and followed me, but when I turned into the camping site, he did not. He drove past, and I honestly thought that was the end of the whole story. I spent the rest of the day and evening forgetting about the incident, and by the time I went to bed, I actually felt comfortable again. I was able to fall asleep really easily. It was a weird sound, I was sleeping in my sleeping bag in my tent, and that noise that woke me up was unfamiliar and very weird. But it wasn't alarming. I just decided to turn on my light and see what was going on. Upon turning on the light, I looked up and immediately saw a silhouette of someone standing outside of my tent. Also, there was the tip of a knife slowly cutting through the fabric of the tent. When the light came on, the slow cutting became a faster ripping. I reacted the only way I knew how. I had a stun gun in my tent for protection. Grabbing it, I lunged at the shadow cutting into my tent. I hit the trigger, heard the zapping sound, coupled with a loud yell, and followed by the thud of someone falling on the ground. Getting out of my tent, I was not at all surprised to see the man from the bar laying on the ground. The stun gun completely knocked him out. I ran off to get camping security, and they called the police. The next time I saw the guy, he was being led away in handcuffs. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. I'm gonna have a little longer of a closing than usual. My birthday is on May 23rd, so I decided to delay this video until today, so I can release a video each day of my birthday week. They won't all be true stories. I still have to put out the April compilation, which will be this week. I will also record one new true story at the beginning of that video. My friend, Aries Leviathan, and I will be doing another collaboration of 2-sentence horror stories. I will also have some subscriber stories, and hopefully another 3 true story video before now and then. As far as the order of these videos, when they'll come out, I cannot be sure. But I hope I can entertain a lot this week. And if you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to hit the subscribe button and the bell below. Or wait for the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment to let me know what you thought of the video, and share it with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address provided in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.